Hello and good afternoon to all of you. I hope all of you are doing well and all of you are in good health. If you can remember, we had concluded the previous class with a neat schematic representation of the various operating system services where we had learned about the different types of user interface, we have learned about different types of operating system services, and we have learned about how interaction takes place between the user interface and the operating system services through the system calls. So in today's class we will learn about the different types of system calls that are possible in an operating system. So to begin with, let us try to discuss some of the important system calls that are associated with process management. So first one is creation of process, loading of process, execution of process, and termination of process. So these are some of the important system calls that are associated with process management. So it allows you to create a process, it allows you to load process, it allows you to execute process, and it allows you to terminate process. So associated with all of these activities, you have system calls in the operating system. Now the next important system call that we have associated with the process is called as get and set process attributes. So in order to get and set process attribute, so we have a system call. So here process attributes basically includes process ID, program counter, process state, priority, the general purpose registers, list of open files, and list of open devices. So these are the attributes of processes that we can fetch and set. Then after that, we have system calls for process scheduling and synchronization. So for performing scheduling of the various processes and preparing it for execution, we have system calls, and for synchronization, we have system calls. Then we have system calls that are capable of elevating memory utilization, that is for allocating memory, for freeing memory, or for dumping memory. So we have system calls. We have system calls for debugging processes. Debugging processes in order to identify in situation if there is any error. Now we have system calls for locking in order to manage access to the shared data between processes. So this is also one of the important system called locks for managing access to shared data between processes. So these are some of the important system calls that are associated with the process. So again I'll repeat it. So we have system calls for creation, loading, execution, and termination of processes. We have system calls for fetching the process attributes and setting the process attributes, wherein the process attributes includes process ID, program counter, process state, priority, general purpose register, list of open files, list of open devices. Then we have system calls for process scheduling and synchronization. We have system calls for memory utilization that allots, frees, and dumps memory. And we have system calls for debugging. We have system calls for locking resources belonging to processes. Resources belonging to processes. And there are many more. So these are some of the prominent system calls associated with the process. Now let us try to go through some of the important system calls that are associated with file management. So we have system calls for creating, deleting, opening, closing, reading, writing, and repositioning files in a computer system. So these are some of the important system calls that are associated with file management. So you have system calls for creation, you have system calls for deletion, you have system calls for opening, you have system calls for closing, you have system calls for reading, you have system calls for writing, and you have system calls for repositioning a file system. Now the next types of system call that may be associated with file management may be get and set file attributes. For example, name of the file, type of the file, location, size, protection, time, date, access, permission, so on and so forth. So we have system calls that are capable of fetching the file attributes as well as setting the file attributes. Now we have system calls that associate with device management. So for an example, system calls for request, release, read, write, and reposition of the devices that are attached to the computer system. So we have system calls for requesting for a device, release for a device, release of a device, reading content from the device, writing content onto the device, and repositioning the device. So we have system calls for all of this. Then we have system calls to get and set device attributes. So this is also very much important. So we have system calls that are capable of fetching the system attributes as well as setting the system attributes. Then we have system calls for attaching and detaching the devices to the computer system. So these are completely logical. So logical in terms in a programming context. So we can attach and detach devices with the help of system calls. And then we have system calls that are capable of managing information. So for an example, we have system calls for fetching and setting date and time. We have system calls for fetching and setting system data. We have system calls for fetching and setting processes, files, and device attributes. So this is all about information management. So we have system calls for getting and setting data and time. We have system calls for getting and setting system data. Then we have system calls for fetching and setting process details, file details, and device details. Now next one is communication management. So we have system calls for creating and deleting communication connections. So through system calls we can establish connection between the various peers, and we can delete communication between various peers. And then we have system calls for sending and receiving messages. Now next one is protection management. So we have system calls that are capable of controlling access to resources. We have system calls that are capable of fetching and setting permissions to the various files and folders and devices that are associated with the computer system. Now we have system calls that are capable of allowing or denying user access to the various resources that are there in the computer system. So these are examples of some of the important system calls that are there in the operating system that enables us to perform various operations using the operating system. So we have learned there are system calls that are associated with processes, there are system calls associated with files, there are system calls associated with devices, there are system calls associated with communication management, there are system calls associated with device management, and so on and so forth. So again we'll repeat it. So with process we can have creation, loading, execution, and termination. With we can also have get and set attributes. We can have system calls for scheduling and synchronization. We have system calls for memory utilization. We have system calls for debugging. We have system calls for locking the resources. Likewise with files, we have system calls for creation, deletion, opening, closing, reading, writing, and repositioning the files. Then we have system calls for fetching and setting the file attributes. Likewise, we have system calls associated with devices that these are request, release, read, write, reposition. Then we have system calls for fetching and setting the device attributes. We have system calls for attaching and detaching the devices. This is the programming logic, so it's rather logical. Then we have system calls for managing information, like fetching and setting the date and time, fetching and setting the system data, fetching and setting the process details, files, and devices. Then we have system calls for communication. So we have system calls for creating and deleting communication connections. We have system calls for sending and receiving messages. Then we have system calls for protection management. We have system calls for controlling access to the resources. We have system calls for fetching and setting the various permissions, and we have system calls for allowing or denying user access. So this basically concludes the fundamentals of the operating system or the unit 1 of the curriculum. Thank you very much. Have a very nice day.